May 8, 1945, Camp Hearn, Texas. The morning sun was already hot when Colonel Matthews walked through the gates carrying papers that should have brought joy to any prisoner. The war in Europe was over. Hitler was dead. Germany had surrendered. The colonel expected cheering when he announced to the 200 German soldiers gathered in the dusty yard that they would soon be going home. Instead, a strange silence fell over the men. They stood there in their denim work clothes, the same ones they wore picking cotton in the Texas fields, and nobody moved. Then a young corporal named Johann Mueller stepped forward from the group. His English was careful but clear when he spoke the words nobody expected. "Please, sir, can we stay?" The colonel thought he had misheard. These men had been captured in North Africa 2 years earlier. They had been shipped across an ocean to an enemy nation. They should have been counting the days until freedom. But Johann was not alone. Behind him, other men began nodding. An older sergeant named Wilhelm Schmidt raised his hand like a schoolboy. "Me too, sir. I want to stay also." Within minutes, dozens of voices were joining in. The American guards looked at each other in confusion. They had seen these Germans arrive in 1943, skinny and terrified, expecting to be shot or tortured. The prisoners had heard stories about what Americans did to their enemies. They knew about the propaganda back home that called Americans savage and cruel. Johann still remembered his first morning at Camp Hearn. He had woken up to a smell that made him cry. It was bacon frying in the mess hall. Real bacon, not the memory of it, not the dream of it, but actual meat sizzling in a pan. When the guards handed him a plate with eggs and toast, and that impossible bacon, he had stared at it for so long that the guard asked if something was wrong. In Germany, his family had been surviving on turnip soup and black bread that was mostly sawdust. His little sister had forgotten what meat tasted like. And here, as a prisoner of his enemies, he was eating better than he had in years. The camp was nothing like what they had expected. Yes, there were fences and guards with rifles. But there were also baseball fields that the Germans had built themselves. There was a library with books in German. There was a theater where they performed plays on Saturday nights. The guards called them by their names, not their numbers. "Fritz," one guard would say to Johann, "You playing soccer this afternoon?" Soccer. They were allowed to play soccer. Johann had worked in the cotton fields 6 days a week. The work was hard under the Texas sun, but they were paid 80 cents a day, same as the regulations said. He could buy cigarettes and chocolate at the camp store. He could send money home to his family, though he had no idea if they were alive to receive it. The local farmers treated them like workers, not prisoners. Mrs. Henderson, whose farm they worked most often, brought them lemonade during the hottest part of the day. Her own son was fighting somewhere in France, but she still smiled at them and asked about their families. One time she brought her radio to the field so they could listen to a baseball game while they worked. None of them understood baseball, but they understood kindness. The real change came at Christmas 1944. The people from the Lutheran church in town had asked the camp commander if some prisoners could come to their Christmas service. 50 men were chosen, Johann among them. They marched through the town in their prisoner uniforms, guards beside them, while Americans watched from their porches. Some faces were angry. Johann understood. These people had sons and husbands fighting against Germany. But when they walked into that small church, something extraordinary happened. The congregation had saved the front rows for them. When the service began and the organ played Silent Night, the German prisoners began singing in their own language. Still Nacht, Heilige Nacht. Their voices filled the church. Then something even more extraordinary happened. The Americans joined them, singing in English. For 3 minutes, in that little Texas church, there was no war. There were just people singing about peace on earth. An old woman in the congregation was crying. After the service, she took Johann's hand and pressed something into it. It was a candy cane. "My boy loved these," she said. "He is buried in Italy." Johann did not know what to say. He kept that candy cane under his pillow until it melted in the summer heat. When the farmers found out the Germans could fix machinery, everything changed even more. These young men who had maintained tanks in the Afrika Korps could repair any tractor, any harvester. They became valuable. Mr. Thompson paid extra under the table for Johann to fix his truck. It was illegal, but nobody reported it. The prisoners were helping bring in the harvest that fed American soldiers. They were part of something important. Some Americans hated this treatment of the enemy. Letters poured into the governor's office. "These men killed our boys," one woman wrote. The transformation did not happen overnight for Johann Müller and the other prisoners at Camp Hearn. It came slowly, like ice melting in spring, one small moment at a time. Johann had been captured in Tunisia when his unit ran out of ammunition. He was 19 years old and had been fighting for only 6 months. The Afrika Korps trained them to expect death if captured by Americans. The propaganda officer had told them stories about American soldiers collecting German ears as trophies. So when Johann surrendered with his hands above his head, he was saying goodbye to life in his mind. Instead, an American soldier gave him water from his own canteen and a chocolate bar. Johann thought it might be poisoned, but he was so thirsty he drank anyway. That was his first surprise. The second surprise came on the ship crossing the Atlantic. They were fed twice a day, real meals with meat and vegetables. The guards played cards and shared cigarettes with them. One guard from Milwaukee taught Johann 5 words of English during the voyage. Hello, thank you, please, water, and bathroom. Those 5 words would change his life. When they arrived at Camp Hearn in July 1943, the heat hit them like a wall. Texas in summer was nothing like Germany. But the barracks had fans. Think about that for a moment. They gave fans to enemy prisoners while American families were rationing everything for the war effort. The camp commander, Colonel Bishop, gathered them on the first day and said something Johann would never forget. "You are soldiers who have done your duty. You will be treated with respect as long as you follow the rules. Work hard, 'cause no trouble, and this war will end someday for all of us." The work in the cotton fields started at dawn to avoid the worst heat. Johann had never seen cotton before. The white bolls stretched for miles like snow that never melted. His hands bled the first week from the sharp husks. But he noticed something strange. The guards did not beat them when they worked slowly. They did not shoot anyone who collapsed from heat. They gave them salt tablets and water breaks every hour. When Otto Fischer fainted one afternoon, the guard radioed for a truck and sent him back to camp for medical treatment. In the German army, Otto would have been kicked until he stood up or died trying. The local people were the biggest surprise. Yes, some hated them. Johann understood why. Mrs. Patterson, who ran the general store in town, had lost her son at Normandy. She would not look at them when they marched past. But others were different. Mr. Rodriguez, who owned the largest farm in the county, learned all their names. He noticed that Wilhelm was good with horses and asked the camp commander if Wilhelm could work exclusively at his stable. He paid Wilhelm extra in fresh eggs and milk, which Wilhelm shared with his bunkmates. The prisoners started a garden behind the kitchen with seeds Mrs. Henderson gave them. They grew tomatoes and beans and lettuce. The American cook, Sergeant Bailey, let them add their vegetables to the camp stew. Soon they were teaching him their mother's recipes. Bailey learned to make sauerkraut and potato dumplings. In return, he taught them about cornbread and fried chicken. Food became a bridge between enemies. The camp had a newspaper written by prisoners in German. They called it the Camp Hearn Echo. At first, the articles were careful and bland, news about sports matches and work schedules. But gradually, the commander allowed more freedom. They printed poems and stories. They ran debates about philosophy and agriculture. Franz Weber, who had been a journalist in Berlin, wrote an article about American democracy that would have gotten him shot in Nazi Germany. He was not punished. Instead, the commander asked him to translate it into English for the guards to read. Music changed everything for many prisoners. The camp had an orchestra made up of 40 prisoners who had been musicians before the war. They gave concerts every Sunday afternoon. Guards brought their families to listen. Children sat on the grass eating ice cream while German prisoners played Beethoven and Mozart. One day, the orchestra learned to play the Star-Spangled Banner. When they performed it at the 4th of July celebration in 1944, grown men cried. These enemies were playing their national anthem with respect and skill. But it was the personal relationships that created the deepest changes. Guard Corporal James Murphy from Boston started a chess club with the prisoners. He had learned chess from his grandfather and was delighted to find Germans who could challenge him. Every evening after dinner, Murphy would sit with Johann and 3 other prisoners, moving pieces across boards they had carved from scrap wood. They taught each other curse words in their languages and laughed until their stomachs hurt. Murphy told them about his girlfriend Mary and showed them her letters. Johann told Murphy about his sister Greta and how she wanted to be a teacher. They stopped seeing each other as enemies and started seeing each other as young men far from home. The work camps were producing 10% of America's agricultural output by 1944. These German prisoners were feeding the nation that was fighting against their homeland. It created a strange feeling in Johann's chest. He was helping America defeat Germany, but America was treating him with more dignity than his own country ever had. In Nazi Germany, he was just a number, a body to throw at the enemy. Here, even as a prisoner, he was a person with a name and rights and dignity. When the Red Cross packages arrived from Germany, they were mostly empty. The Nazi government had stolen the contents. But the American Red Cross packages were full of soap and socks and candy. The guards apologized that there was not more. The news of Germany's surrender on May 8, 1945 should have been the happiest day of Johann Müller's life as a prisoner. The war that had taken him from his family, that had sent him to fight in African deserts, that had made him a captive in a foreign land, was finally over. But as Johann stood in that dusty Texas yard with Colonel Matthews, explaining they would soon be processed for repatriation, all he felt was dread. Home. What did that word even mean now? The last letter from his mother was dated November 1943, almost 2 years ago. She wrote that Hamburg was being bombed every night. She wrote that they were sleeping in the subway stations. She wrote that his father had been drafted into the Volkssturm, the last desperate army of old men and boys. After that, silence. Johann did not know if his family was alive. He did not know if his house was standing. He did not know if Hamburg itself still existed. The other prisoners felt the same fear. Wilhelm Schmidt had been a baker in Dresden. Dresden was gone, burned to ashes in February 1945. Everyone knew this. The guards had not hidden the news from them. Franz Weber was from Berlin. The Russians had taken Berlin. Everyone knew what the Russians did to German prisoners and German civilians. Otto Fischer was from a small village in East Prussia. East Prussia did not exist anymore. It was part of Poland now. His village had a Polish name he could not pronounce. Where would Otto go? What would he find? This was why Johann had stepped forward and asked to stay. This was why dozens of men behind him nodded in agreement. They were not choosing America over Germany. They were choosing certainty over chaos. They were choosing life over whatever waited for them in the ruins of the Reich. Colonel Matthews did not know what to say to their request. He promised to ask his superiors and walked away shaking his head. That night, the prisoners could not sleep. They talked in whispers about possibilities. Maybe they could stay and work. America needed farm workers. They had proven themselves reliable. They had caused no trouble. Some had even saved American farms from losing their harvests. Surely that counted for something. The next morning, Wilhelm started a petition. His English was the best among them, learned from long conversations with Corporal Murphy. He wrote carefully on a piece of Red Cross stationery. We, the undersigned prisoners of war at Camp Herne, respectfully request permission to remain in the United States as agricultural workers. We have demonstrated our work ethic and peaceful intentions. We wish to contribute to American society and start new lives as law-abiding residents. Within 3 days, over 1,000 prisoners from camps across Texas had signed similar petitions. The story reached the newspapers. German prisoners begged to stay in America, read the headline in the Dallas Morning News. The public reaction was swift and divided. Some Americans were outraged. These were enemy soldiers who had killed American boys. How dare they ask to stay? Letters poured into Congress demanding immediate deportation. Send them back to the hell they created, one veteran wrote. But other Americans felt differently. Farmers who had employed the prisoners wrote letters of support. These men saved my harvest, wrote Mr. Thompson. They worked harder than any crew I ever hired. Mrs. Henderson wrote to her congressman. These young men are not Nazis. They are boys who got caught up in something terrible. They have learned what democracy means. Send them back to the Russians, and they will be killed or enslaved. Is that American justice? The churches got involved. The Lutheran minister who had invited prisoners to Christmas service organized a campaign. He collected signatures from his congregation, supporting the prisoners' request to stay. "These men sang hymns with us," he wrote. "They prayed with us. They are our brothers in Christ. How can we send them back to certain death or communist slavery?" The debate reached Washington. The State Department said it was impossible. The Geneva Convention required repatriation of all prisoners. America had signed the treaty. If America kept German prisoners who wanted to stay, what would stop other countries from keeping American prisoners who might be forced to say they wanted to stay? It was a matter of international law and diplomatic precedent. But there was a loophole discovered by an immigration lawyer in Houston who had been following the story. The prisoners could not stay as prisoners, but once repatriated to Germany, they could apply to immigrate to America like anyone else. They would need sponsors, American citizens who would guarantee employment and housing. They would need to wait in line with millions of other Europeans trying to escape the destroyed continent. But it was possible. When Johann heard about this loophole, he felt both hope and despair. He would have to go back to Germany first. He would have to find whatever was left of his family. He would have to survive in the ruins long enough to apply for immigration. He would need an American sponsor, who would sponsor a former enemy soldier. Then Corporal Murphy did something extraordinary. He came to the barracks one evening with a piece of paper. It was a letter addressed to the Immigration and Naturalization Service. "I, James Murphy, citizen of the United States, hereby agree to sponsor Johann Mueller for immigration to the United States. I will provide employment at my family's construction business in Boston and lodging at my personal residence until such time as Mr. Mueller can establish himself independently." Murphy was not alone. Across Texas, farmers and ranchers and businessmen were writing similar letters. Mr. Rodriguez sponsored Wilhelm to work at his stables. Mrs. Henderson, whose own son had died in France, sponsored 3 prisoners who had worked her fields. Even the Lutheran minister sponsored Franz Weber, saying he needed an assistant who could help with the growing German immigrant congregation. The journey back to Germany in June 1946 was nothing like the journey to America 3 years earlier. The Liberty ship taking Johann and 500 other prisoners home was the same type that had brought them as captives, but everything else was different. This time, they were not enemies being transported to prison. They were men returning to a destroyed nation, carrying American dollars in their pockets and impossible dreams in their hearts. The guards who accompanied them to the port in Houston shook their hands goodbye. Corporal Murphy pressed a pack of cigarettes and $20 into Johann's hand. "For the journey," he said. "Write to me when you get there. Tell me what you find." The ocean voyage took 14 days. The prisoners, who were not prisoners anymore but not quite free men either, spent the time teaching each other English phrases they had learned. They shared addresses of American sponsors. They made plans that seemed like fantasy. Wilhelm would return to Texas and open a German bakery. Otto would work for Mr. Thompson and save money to bring his younger brother to America. Franz would help at the Lutheran church and write for the local newspaper. They all knew these dreams might die the moment they reached Germany. As the ship approached Bremerhaven, the singing stopped. The men crowded onto the deck to see their homeland. What they saw made grown men weep. The port was ruins. The city beyond was rubble and twisted metal. This was not the Germany they had left. This was a graveyard. The British soldiers who processed them at the port were efficient but cold. They were given displacement cards and ration books. They were told which zones they could travel to. Johann's Hamburg was in the British zone, so he could go home, or what was left of home. Wilhelm's Dresden was in the Soviet zone. He was warned not to go there. Former German soldiers were being arrested and sent to labor camps in Siberia. Franz's Berlin was divided between 4 powers. He would need special permission to enter. The train journey to Hamburg took 2 days. Before the war, it would have taken 4 hours. But the tracks were broken and repaired, broken and repaired. The train stopped constantly. Johann saw his country through the window and could not recognize it. Cities were moonscapes of broken buildings. The countryside was scarred with bomb craters. People walked along the roads pulling carts with their belongings, going nowhere, coming from nowhere. Everyone was thin. Everyone was gray. Everyone looked defeated. Hamburg was worse than Johann had imagined. Entire neighborhoods were gone, not damaged but erased. He walked from the station to where his street should have been. It took him 3 hours to find it because all the landmarks were gone. The church where he was confirmed was a pile of bricks. The school where he learned to read was a burned shell. His family's apartment building was standing, but barely. Half of it had collapsed. The other half leaned at an angle that defied physics. He climbed the broken stairs to the 3rd floor. The door to his family's apartment was gone, replaced by a blanket. He called out, "Mother, Father, Greta." A woman appeared, but it was not his mother. She was a stranger who had claimed the apartment when she found it empty. She knew nothing about the Mueller family. "Try the refugee center," she said. "Everyone goes there looking for everyone." The refugee center was a former factory converted into a maze of desks and bulletin boards. The boards were covered with thousands of notes. "Looking for my husband Heinrich Braun, last seen in Stalingrad. Seeking information about my children evacuated from Berlin. Anyone knowing the whereabouts of the Fischer family from Cologne, please contact." Johann wrote his own note and pinned it to the board. Then he spent hours reading every other note, looking for his family's names. On the 4th day, a miracle. A woman at the center recognized his family name. "The Muellers from Adolfstrasse. Yes, I knew them. Your mother and sister are alive. They went to the countryside, to your mother's cousin near Lüneburg. Your father." She paused. "He did not come back from the Volkssturm. I am sorry." Johann found his mother and Greta living in a chicken coop that had been converted into a shelter. When his mother saw him, she collapsed. They had received notice that he was missing in Africa 2 years ago. They thought he was dead. Everyone thought everyone was dead in those days. His sister Greta was 15 now but looked 40. She had been working in a munitions factory that was bombed. Her hands were scarred from burns. Her hearing was damaged. The beautiful girl who wanted to be a teacher was gone. They survived on 800 calories a day from ration cards. They grew potatoes in the small garden. They collected wood for heating. They waited in lines for everything. Bread lines, water lines, coal lines. This was life in defeated Germany. This was what the conquering armies had left them. This was why Johann needed to leave. He told his mother about America, about the farm work and the kind guards and the German orchestra playing for American families, about Mrs. Henderson's lemonade and Corporal Murphy's chess games, about the petition to stay and the sponsorship letter and the possibility of immigration. His mother cried again, but differently. "Take it," she said. "Go back to America. Build a life. Maybe someday you can bring us too. But even if you cannot go, there is nothing here but ghosts and hunger. Do not die slowly with us. Live for us instead." The application process was a nightmare of forms and interviews and medical examinations. The American consulate in Hamburg was overwhelmed with applications. Every surviving German seemed to have a cousin in Milwaukee or an uncle in Chicago they hoped would sponsor them. Johann waited in Hamburg for 18 months while his immigration application moved through the American bureaucracy. Those months were harder than his years as a prisoner. In Texas, he had dignity and purpose and 3 meals a day. In destroyed Hamburg, he had freedom but nothing else. He worked clearing rubble for the British occupation forces, earning barely enough to feed himself and help his mother and sister. Every brick he moved, every twisted piece of metal he carried away, reminded him of what his country had done and what had been done to his country in return. The other former prisoners from Camp Herne were scattered across Germany, each fighting their own battle to reach America. Wilhelm had made it to Dresden despite the warnings and found nothing. His family was dead. His bakery was ash. The Soviets had arrested him for being a former Wehrmacht soldier, but he escaped from the transport train and made his way to the American zone. He was living in a displaced persons camp near Munich, waiting for his visa. Otto had better luck. His family had survived in a refugee camp in Schleswig-Holstein. His sponsor, Mr. Thompson, had sent money for his passage and extra for his family. Franz was in Berlin, working for an American newspaper as a translator while waiting for his paperwork. They wrote letters to each other, sharing information about the immigration process, encouraging each other when the wait seemed endless. Finally, in January 1948, Johann received the letter that would change his life. His visa had been approved. Corporal Murphy, now just James Murphy, civilian, had sent money for the ship passage. Report to Hamburg port on February 15th for departure to New York. From there, take the train to Boston. I will meet you at South Station. We have work to do. The parting from his mother and Greta was the hardest thing Johann had ever done, harder than combat, harder than capture, harder than imprisonment. His mother pressed a small photograph into his hand, the only family picture that had survived the bombing. Remember us, she said, but do not look back. America is your future now. Make us proud. Make your life worth our sacrifice. The ship to America was filled with immigrants, displaced persons, war brides, and a handful of former prisoners like Johann. They were not welcomed by everyone aboard. One group of Jewish refugees recognized his accent and turned away from him. He understood. How could they not hate every German after what had been done? But others were kinder. An old Polish man who had lost everything shared his bread with Johann. We are all refugees now, he said. The past is dead. We go to America to be reborn. The Statue of Liberty on a cold February morning in 1948 looked exactly like the pictures, but also nothing like them. It was larger and smaller at the same time. Johann stood on the deck with hundreds of others, many crying, some praying, all hoping. The immigration officers at Ellis Island were overwhelmed, but not unkind. They processed him quickly. Name: Johann Mueller. Occupation: agricultural worker and mechanic. Sponsor: James Murphy of Boston. Purpose of visit: permanent residence. Welcome to America, Mr. Mueller. Next. The train ride to Boston showed him an America he had never seen as a prisoner. Cities undamaged by war. Factories producing cars instead of tanks. Stores full of food and clothes and things he had forgotten existed. People who were fat, actually fat, walking around complaining about ordinary problems. The coffee was too cold. The train was 5 minutes late. The newspaper cost 2 cents more than last year. These complaints sounded like paradise to someone who had seen real suffering. James Murphy was waiting at South Station as promised. He looked different out of uniform, older, more substantial. He grabbed Johann in an embrace that surprised them both. You made it, you magnificent bastard. Come on, my mother has dinner waiting. She has been cooking for 3 days. The Murphy family lived in a 3-story house in Dorchester. It was not fancy by American standards, but to Johann it was a palace. His own room with a bed and a closet and a window that was not broken. Indoor plumbing that worked. Electric lights that stayed on. Heat that came from a furnace, not stolen wood. Mrs. Murphy had indeed been cooking for days. Corned beef and cabbage and potatoes and bread and pie. So much food that Johann could not eat it although he tried. Mr. Murphy owned a construction company rebuilding Boston's aging infrastructure. You know engines and machines, right? He asked Johann. We need mechanics for the equipment. Pay is good. Work is steady. You start Monday. That first year in Boston was like learning to walk again. Johann became John Miller because Mueller was too German for some customers. He worked 6 days a week maintaining bulldozers and cranes and trucks. He sent half his wages to his mother in Germany. He attended night school to improve his English. He went to church with the Murphys on Sunday, sitting in the same pew with people who had no idea he had once worn a Wehrmacht uniform. Slowly, he built an American life. He rented his own apartment. He bought a used car. He went to baseball games with James and learned to love the Red Sox. He met a girl named Dorothy at a church dance. She was Irish-American, second generation, with red hair and green eyes and a laugh that made him forget every sad thing that had ever happened. When he told her he had been a German soldier, a prisoner of war, she said everyone deserves a second chance. This is America. We all came here running from something. The question is what you do next.